This is the Fortuniana plant in our garden from which we get most of our cuttings, and you can see it's made some very long canes over the summer. Generally in the late spring and early summer it makes very long, straight, thick, virtually thornless canes, and those make great cuttings for using as rootstocks. At other times of the year, late summer, early fall, it tends to make much thinner canes with often a lot of prickles on them, so they're not as desirable. Here is one of those canes showing that it has just, well, this one has no prickles at all along it for a good long distance. This is a cluster of canes that I cut from that large Fortuniana bush out in the garden, and it's important to keep them damp, so we use a spritzer bottle to spray them every few minutes. And as you can see, they're quite straight. They don't have any thorns. They have a lot of leaves. At some point as you move up toward the tip, not only are they getting too thin to use, but they're also becoming soft with the new growth. You really want hard, stiff wood, and so I'm going to cut off maybe the top foot to foot and a half of these canes, and then I can turn the rest into cuttings. So I'm going to turn this cane into cuttings. The length of the cutting is going to be based on where you want to graft it. I normally like to put my grafted buds about 6 inches above the soil surface. I'm going to need 1 inch to 1.5 inches underground for this to make roots, and then I don't want to graft the very top of my cutting. So I tend to make probably a 10 to 12 inch long cutting is the ideal size for a Fortuniana that I've planted to graft. And I can just turn this cane into several of those. This is probably the last one I'm going to make, simply because it's becoming quite a bit thinner, and then this part also is still quite soft from the new growth. So from these, I can do the same thing. You always want to leave at least 3 leaves. More is even better. And you'd like to have a leaf up near the top of your cutting, wherever that is. That helps with rooting. It kind of helps prevent dieback of the little plant. I'm going to 3 out of that one. And as you would do if you were pruning a rose properly, I'm making these cuts just above a bud. So there's a nice stack of cuttings. I'm going to spritz those. And if I'm not ready to use those right away, I can just cover them with wet paper towels or a plastic bag, something of that sort, and they'll keep for a while. I don't want them to get too hot. I'm in a room right now that's air conditioned, but if I were outside, I certainly would not let these sit out in the sun. When you stick these, because Fortuniana makes these large canes that come out of the bush and then they curve and they go back down, the leaves toward the end are on downward facing canes, and sometimes the leaves will turn around, and so they're kind of upside down on the stem. It's really important that the cutting be stuck right side up. So the easy way to tell that is where a leaf joins the stem, the leaf always comes out at an upward facing angle. So this is a right side up cutting. No matter what direction that leaf was turned, it might have looked more like that, but it wouldn't matter. Where it joins the stem is aimed up, and if you look in there, there is a bud just above that. This, of course, would be an upside down cutting. It might make roots, but it would never grow into a good rose bush. There are several kinds of rooting hormone that you can use. Some people don't use rooting hormones at all. People have been rooting cuttings for thousands of years without them, but they really can help. They don't tend to speed up the rate at which a cutting makes roots. If it's normally 3 weeks, it'll still be 3 weeks if you use a hormone. The thing is, if you stick 100 of those cuttings, without the hormone, maybe 50 of them would live. With the hormone, maybe 90 of them will live. So it dramatically improves the success rate of cuttings that actually make some roots. And then among those cuttings that do make roots, the ones with the hormone will tend to have more roots in the same number of time. They'll be the same amount of time. They'll be longer, they'll be more branched. You just get a better overall root system if you use a hormone. So we always do. You can get powdered hormones. There are several different brands, or liquid. The main liquid being used is Dip and Grow. Lots of other powdered brands though. They come in different strength levels. Even though there are different manufacturers of the powders, they all work about the same way. The hormone in them tends to be IBA, that's indole 3-butyric acid, which is the most commonly used rooting hormone in plants. And they tend to number their products 1, 2, and 3. And even between brands, the number 1 tends to be the same concentration across brands, and number 2 and number 3 the same. For roses, I like to use a number 2, and we tend to use Hormone brand just because that's what we happen to have. It is a powder based in talcum powder, and it is 0.3%, so there's not very much IBA in there. I don't like to dip my cuttings directly into the jar, because if the cutting is at all damp, I will have introduced moisture to this jar. It's a fairly expensive jar of material, and I don't want it to mold or otherwise go bad from being wet. So I always shake a little bit of it out into a container, depending on how many cuttings I'm going to make, maybe a teaspoon to a tablespoon of it. And when I'm finished, I'll throw that away, but my main jar remains uncontaminated. So that's ready to use. For the Dip and Grow, it is a liquid, and the nice thing about it is that you can make it any concentration you want. So you dilute it just with plain tap water, and for most roses, we would use 1 part of Dip and Grow to 7 or 8 parts water. Some people even use 10 parts water. For Fortuniana, which is a little more difficult to root, I usually make it either 1 part Dip and Grow to 6 or 7 parts of water. I'm going to do 1 to 7 today. So to do that, I've got a container here. I happen to be using a laboratory beaker, but you could use a solo cup or anything else you wanted to. And just because it's a convenient volume when I'm done, I tend to use a ½ tablespoon measure. So there's a ½ tablespoon of Dip and Grow. And again, when I'm finished, I'm going to throw this away. So then I'll just go to the sink, and I'm going to put 7 of the same size spoon, in this case ½ tablespoons, into here. 1, 2. So now that's known as a 1 to 7 solution. Stir it up a bit, wash my spoon off, and that's ready to go. And that will keep certainly all day. The Dip and Grow itself is, it comes to you as an alcohol solution. So if we were to let this sit overnight or for a longer period of time, it would slowly change concentration because the alcohol is evaporating off of it much faster than the water. So I never keep it more than 1 day, but that would last for a whole day. If we're sticking thousands of cuttings, we would use it up, but that's ready to go. You can root cuttings in almost any kind of container. We tend to do them in a tray of 25 of these so-called band pots. They're a little over 2 inches wide in each direction and about 6 inches deep. And the bottom, the reason they're called band pots is they have 2 bands of plastic, but most of the bottom is open. I like that. It works well. It's very well drained, and we can fit 25 cuttings into this amount of space. The media that you plant in is also going to vary. You can use regular garden soil, you can use commercial potting soil. Some people like to use just perlite. What we're using is a blend of about 50-50 Canadian peat and perlite. It's got a little bit of vermiculite in it. It's just kind of a standard potting soil. I do think it's important not to over compact the soil, because that will slow down the movement of water through it. And if the soil becomes waterlogged, your cuttings are much less likely to survive. So I'm not pressing down on this at all. I'm just kind of filling and leveling it off. And then once I've done that, I learned this little trick from my greenhouse manager. You can get the perfect amount of compaction if you hold it about 6 or 8 inches above the table and drop it. It's noisy, but that has compacted a little bit. And so now we can just refill that again and not press down on it at all, and that will result in pots that are filled perfectly. There'll be enough of a lip at the top to water them, but they're not really at all compacted. So then I take this in the greenhouse and water it until it's really saturated with water. So I've got these in the greenhouse on the bench. I'm going to just water these until they're really saturated. I want water gushing out the bottom. Some people don't water their cutting soil very much because they're afraid of drowning the cutting. If your soil is not well drained, that can happen. But this is such well drained soil in such well drained pots that I like to start out with it truly saturated. And besides, in our mist bed, it puts out enough mist that they're going to drip almost constantly anyway until they're rooted. So the way to avoid rotting is to have very well drained soil, not to restrict the amount of water that you're using on them. So those are saturated. I'll let them sit there for a few minutes till they quit dripping, and then we can take them back and work on the cuttings. Compared to other roses, Fortuniana is kind of notorious for being difficult to root. We root it in an intermittent mist bed. That's what you see here. It has a bench that's up, about knee high, and then expanded fiberglass walls around it with shower doors in the front, so it's protected from the wind in all directions, but the interior is just open, so it gets absolutely full sun all day. There, it just went off. How convenient. So we root our cuttings in there, and one of the things that I consider important in rooting Fortuniana is that you give it as much light as you possibly can. As I say, this one in Lakeland, Florida is getting absolutely full sun at noon, so the mist allows that to happen. If you were rooting them in a bag or a bottle, you would have to protect them from getting too hot. And then these are some Fortuniana cuttings that one of our classes has stuck. Those are about a week old, so they're not rooted yet. The way we know they're ready to come out of the mist bed is by looking at the bottom of the pot, and if we can see little roots coming out, that's a good indication that that cutting is ready to be removed from the mist. If you unpot these, you can see they have a very nice root system inside that pot. And that is certainly ready to come out of the mist, and very soon after that, in a few weeks, we can bud it. These are the two cuttings that I was just showing in the pot. They have rooted nicely. I've washed the soil away to show where the roots come out. The wounds that are made on the side are important because you get most of your roots coming from those. If you don't wound the base, right here you can see that's a cluster of roots that came from the base of the cutting. But all the rest of these are coming from those wounds. So I really think it's important to have the side wounding, and then also to treat those wounds with whatever hormone you're using to stimulate rooting. Okay. I have my handful of Fortuniana cuttings here. I have a water spritzer. I want to keep these damp all the time. And here are my filled pots. Here is my hormone ready to go. So to take a cutting, you need enough space at the bottom that you can fit it into the soil comfortably without burying any leaves. On the other hand, I like to leave at least 3 leaves on top. I'm going to break that one off. Some people DI them so that the those lower buds don't ever sprout out. I don't usually, but I just did that on that one, so that won't sprout now. I usually just leave them and then I break the suckers off later if they produce suckers. So I'm going to put a wound at the base of this. You're not sharpening it like a pencil. You are just cutting a little peel of bark, almost as if you were peeling a carrot. That's maybe 1/2 inch long. You could go longer. I usually make it right at 1/2 inch. And then you flip it over 180 degrees and you do another one. So I've got 2 bark peels there with a lot of bark coming down on the sides. And it's along those edges of the wound that we're going to get most of our rooting. If I'm going to use the powdered hormone, I'm now going to dip this, making sure that I cover the bottom of the cut as well as the side wounds I just made. And then I'm going to tap that to get rid of as much of that extra dust as I can. If you've got globs of hormone powder there, it actually inhibits rooting. Now, because the powder is just barely stuck to the surface, if I just cram that down into the soil, it's going to wipe most of it away. So what I'm going to do is pre-poke the hole with my finger. You could use a pencil or a pen. And then I'm going to lower this into that hole and then just gently pack soil around it. That guarantees that most of that powder that was originally on the cutting is still there. If I do a liquid hormone, the Hormone, again I'm going to, the dip and grow, if you want to DI the base, you can. That simply means removing those buds where there was a leaf so they don't sprout later. As I said, I don't normally do that, but I will this time. And then this one has kind of a dead looking base, so I'm going to recut that just so it's a fresh cut. You will get some roots out of that base if it's fresh. I'm going to make my peels on the two sides. Not going real deep into the wood, really just peeling bark away, but I want it to be white. And then dip it into the dip and grow solution. This is called a quick dip. That's kind of a misnomer because you actually need to dip them for more than 5 seconds. We usually try to give them about 10 seconds. You may want to stir it around a bit. We did an experiment one time where we did them for 5 seconds and 10 and 15, up to as much as 5 minutes. And anywhere from 5 seconds to somewhat more than 3 minutes, we got exactly the same results, which were quite excellent. So that's nicely coated now. For this, because some of that liquid has already been sucked into that cutting, I don't have to pre-poke the hole. I just stick it in. The depth I'm going to, probably an inch or an inch and a half, just enough to really hold that in place. Once I've filled this tray, I'll put a stake in the end that says what the date was, put the whole thing in the mist bed, and 3 to 4 weeks later it's ready to come out. Until I go to the mist, because I'm in an air-conditioned room here, these are drying out. So every couple minutes, after every 3 or 4 cuttings, I'll go around and spritz them again until I've got this tray full and I'm ready to go to the mist with it.